First Corinthians 6 just for a little bit. I told you that I was going to look and to see what the greatest of scholarly minds had to say as to why the sin of sexual immorality was a sin against their own body. Um, but before that, we looked at a couple things, and here's what I liked that I read more and more about, because this concept of this type of behavior, this type of action, that's only acceptable to God in the covenant of marriage, inside the marriage unit. Um, but anyways, it continues and spills over into First Corinthians 7, and there's lots of questions about it. Um, but I told you last week that in there in verse 18 when it says flee from sexual immorality, right? And I told you that every time I think of this term flee, um, I think of Joseph and Potiphar's wife in Genesis 39, where this was uh, a potential sin that was going to occur. Potiphar's wife had eyes for Joseph. Joseph, instead of just rebuffing, and well, I'm not gonna entertain the idea, but you know, and sometimes we get caught up in that, don't we? I mean, we slip into that temptation because instead of running from something, we just like, okay, well, I'm just gonna dabble in it, or I'm just gonna sit here, or I'm just gonna flirt with this person, or whatever it may be. But no, instead, as you read Genesis 39, Joseph flees. I mean, he runs. He runs so fast and so straight away that when Potiphar's wife grabs his robe, he is all natural and he's running out of the place. But he doesn't want to fall into that act. He doesn't want to be accused of those things. And in reality, even though Joseph is sold by his brothers and he finds himself in a rough situation after he is sold, he ends up finding favor with the king and becomes a actually fairly high ranking servant of the king. And so he certainly wouldn't want to also um, what's the right term? Soil his name. Okay, so I like that. Flee from the sins, right? Especially here, flee from this, right? So as I read more and more, I dug up some things, but for the most part, we covered it, and I will try to capture the main ideas that we talked about last week. The reason why it's a sin against our own body is because, and it wasn't until I read from one of the commentators that it made even more sense. God doesn't want to just save our soul. He's got a purpose for the soul, of course, our soul, but he's also going to save, if you will, and resurrect the body. Okay, and I guess I never really kind of put two and two together, if you will. I never dwelt on that concept. And so the things that we do with our body are a big deal to God. Okay. Um, and is why just before this that we reviewed last week, so I won't do it too much, but is why Paul writes there in verse 14, 1 Corinthians 6:14, and God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. This is the idea of the resurrection, right? So, what we do with our bodies is a big deal. And remember, like I said last week, for whatever reason, the new Christians in Corinth, by the way, at the most, these Christians would have been 48 months old, if you will. So, in other words, that church was established only 4 years prior to this letter. That's pretty that's still almost in the infancy stage, right? There's got to be a lot of questions. They don't have the written word like we do. They don't even have a letter up to this point. They have some evangelists coming through, of course, but there were questions regarding, or these Corinthians thought, well, I have liberty to do whatever I want with my body. It's no big deal, right? It's about the soul. But Paul's making a connection. No, it's about the body too, right? And our bodies should not be used in manners that are unholy, or our bodies should not be used um, to satisfy the desires of the flesh, or the temptations. Yes. Hmm. Right. And he goes on to talk about in verse 19 there that the reason why it's also a sin against our own bodies is because our bodies are a temple for the Holy Spirit. But let's go back to this idea of, let me just flesh out a little bit more of these ideas about the body, right? So our bodies have the Holy Spirit dwelling within it. As a result, we are not to defile our bodies, especially with like the example here is a prostitute, right? But that's just one example. It's all this kind of behavior outside of the marriage covenant. Okay, um, with anyone, right? Uh, when people participate in this kind of behavior, they become one. In this case, in these examples, obviously with unbelievers. Also in Corinth during this time, many of these women who um, had this profession would have likely been also connected, if you will, uh, to um, to the pagans and idol worshippers to the point where, hey Ben, can you do me a favor? I'm going to put you on the spot. Can you take these teens into the other room and teach them? Thank you. So they would have been associated, these prostitutes, they would have been associated with other pagan gods. And then, and when you really unfold all this, now it's a Christian who's not just having these actions with some random person, but someone who is so immoral themselves, so corrupt to the point that they're pagan practicers are practicing. And so, and then lastly, the thing I found. So again, it defiles us because we're supposed to just be united with Christ. We're supposed to have oneness with Christ, with Him, and then I did find an awful lot about the psychological effect. In fact, one of the things I read, which was really fascinating, is they're finding out more and more that as young men and even young women, as they have multiple partners in this type of behavior before they're married, they actually struggle to stay with their future married spouse. It's a psychological thing. It's almost become normal that after you're with someone for a while and that kind of gets old, then you move on to something else. And they really struggle with deep, sincere, godly, holy intimacy, not physical intimacy, with a future somebody that's supposed to be monogamous and lifelong. Okay, so again, there was that psychological aspect of things. So, uh, and remember, he's going to use this term a lot in the next chapter as well. But at the very end there, verse 19 and 20 says, "You are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body." And he's going to say that again over and over. Let's get into 7. Um, Again, this indicates, of course, there was another letter written. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, period. But because of temptation to sexual immorality, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. There's where you also get the idea that as a Christian, this polygamy, if you will, multiple wives or et cetera, is no longer accepted at all. Okay, it's one wife and one husband. Okay, um, but this is because, and again, last week I said that there's many reasons to get married, and there is. Okay, of course there is. Go back to Genesis 2, and it wasn't good for Adam to be alone, so God decided to provide a help meet. Geraldine was sharing a little bit about a book that she had read, and she's passed on the title about was it about being a good helpmeet? Yeah, and there's lots of different books like that. Serena, I shared with you last week that during premarital counseling, one of the books we read was Love and Respect. There's also His Needs, Her Needs. There are so many things out there. There's even an old book from the 70s called The Act of Marriage. I will warn you, the act of marriage, um, is specifically dealing the act of intimate, physical, intimate relationships with your husband or wife, and it addresses that almost exclusively. But these other books talk about so many other things that come along with marriage. Remember, the people in Corinth, this was a huge temptation. It was a huge stumbling block. So Paul's telling them, look, if you can't control yourselves, that's what it says. Right, as he continues, if you can't control yourselves, then you should get married. And in that bond, in that covenant, you are allowed to do these things. Without beating a dead horse, um, I shared with you I shared with you the fact that as you read these books, and I even joked with about Alex and Brianna and giving them the Love and Respect book, that both men and women have different needs. We do to a degree. Sometimes they overlap, some of them, but in a very real sense, there are different things. In fact, the reason why the book we read was called Love and Respect is at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, women need to feel love, like sincere love, like Christ loved the church. Okay? And at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, men need to feel that they are respected. Okay? That's the idea of love and respect. That's also a biblical concept found in Galatians. Okay? So it's nothing foreign, it's biblically based. Um, it's the idea of the women humbling themselves, and then men loving their wives as Christ loved the church. Which, oh, by the way, if you understand that instruction, that would carry over to the way you would have a mutual agreement to not have this sexual relations when there's times that each party needs time for God, time to heal, and these kinds of things, right? It's not saying that men, even though you're married, you don't have to practice self control at times. That's not what it's saying, right? These agreements to break, if you will, there in verse 5 for a limited time. He gives the examples that you can devote yourself to prayer and then come back again together so that Satan may not tempt you because you lack self control. Unfortunately, too, and um, is why just in general, we desire the eldership desires to get someone out here that does really good with a marriage seminar, right? A marriage seminar. And there are lots of men in the brotherhood. In fact, the guy who I quoted from and I grabbed a lot of his sermon a couple weeks ago on 1 Kings 19, the gentleman out there in Lubbock, he does those things. And he's very good at it, but he's also booked for 2 years out. And so, I mean, that's the success of his ministry, right? But 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 in a very real sense, I think that's why I also promoted premarital counseling, right? Getting together with the minister, getting together with an elder or his wife or an elder, and you discuss these things. Because when you're young and still selfish, and the front part of our brains isn't fully developed if we're that young when we decide to entertain perhaps engagements in marriage, you need to learn a lot about your duties as a husband for your wife and vice versa. And what Paul is explaining here is that part of these duties, if if in order to not be tempted, is to have this type of relationship. It's very important to the marriage, and I'll leave it at that as we move on. All right, verse 6, it says, "Now as a concession I command, not as a command I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God. One of one kind and one of another." What's interesting is some of the commentators wanted to connect verse 6 with his the end of verse 5, which I've never read it like that. I personally haven't, right? In other words, you need to take time, you need to take breaks every once in a while in this part of your marriage, right? I always liked it to continue with the concept of celibacy. And that's what Paul is I think that's what he's going to get into here, right? What's funny is you have to put yourself back in first century Christianity. Because in our Western cultures, in our Western society, right, not getting married is not that common, right? It's, of course, there are a bunch of people who choose not to get married, and Paul ends up saying that's great, that's fantastic. But it's because they have the gift to remain celibate, right? They're for example, perhaps Paul's drive for some of these intimate, physically intimate behaviors with a woman, perhaps they weren't that strong for him, right? Perhaps, perhaps the fact that Paul was so incredibly focused on Christ and carrying out God's will and to be a messenger of God for the Gentiles, and he kept himself so busy, so devoted, so dedicated that he really wasn't concerned with at times being lonely. I mean, it sounds like over and over he prepared himself for the idea of not just loneliness at times, but unfair punishment, imprisonment, even physical pains and beatings and death. Yes, did you have something, Galen? Hmm. Yeah, that's a shame, and it's certainly not what God desires and envisioned um, when He established that institute. If you remember, Wayne liked to call it the second greatest institute ever established or ever created. Right, first being the church, and second would be marriage. But yeah, it's a sad deal. And so what Paul's doing here is Paul is saying, look, as a concession, this is just a recommendation. It's not a command. It's nothing from God. Here's just some of my advice. And as you read the rest of 1 Corinthians 7, he's going to say, hey, look, especially when he says, I, not the Lord, say this, which we're going to get to that in a moment in verse 12. But what he's saying is, look, I have some wisdom. I do have some authority, right? And I'm going to share with you what I think, right? What has been good for me, and here's why these things have been good for me. So, again, he says that he wishes all were as myself am. We know for a fact that at this time Paul was not married. Remember last week I brought up that historically speaking, some scholars say maybe he was at one time. I read another very compelling article that suggests that Paul was married because of the language he's going to use here in verses. Um, in verse 11, and then he's going to also bring it up later in the chapter about being unmarried. Unmarried. And why unmarried? Anyways, I'll share that with you in a moment. But people say, and here's kind of what the article was about. Why do some people say that Paul was maybe married? Right? There's nothing in Scripture that even really alludes to that. Some people grasp at one passage in First Corinthians, which we'll get to in a few weeks, which talks about basically Paul is saying that we could take our wives, the apostles, the evangelists, we could take our wives on us during our missionary journeys. They're free to do those things. But because of the way that Paul speaks, some suggest, oh well, um, is he married? Is he not? He's not married when he writes Corinthians. In fact, and this person in particular thinks that he was a widower. Okay, that he may have been married because, by Paul's own words, he was trying to be a Pharisee of Pharisees. Right? Remember when Paul kind of lays out his whole Jewish life and his accomplishments, if you will. And one of the things he talks about is being that Pharisee. Well, as you work your way through um, that process, eventually ending up in the Sanhedrin, it was very, very, very uncommon for anybody to be considered a high level Pharisee or even in the Sanhedrin without being married. Okay? without being married. Now, we don't know for sure. We don't know. That's purely speculative, but I think it's kind of enjoyable to read. But he's saying, right now, I wish you had the gift that I have. And I have the gift that I don't need to be married. I don't need to. And that's a good thing for me, right? So in verse 8, that's where I was going. I just didn't go back far enough. In verse 8, he says, to the unmarried and the widows. The word unmarried is different than the word he uses later for betrothed in this chapter. For example, in 1 Corinthians 7:25, he uses the word betrothed. Okay? Betrothed in the Greek language literally meant virgin. And for the most part, in this context, it means a woman. Okay? A woman. But it also can be a man who has never known a woman. But again, context dictates how that is supposed to be interpreted, right? This guy suggests that the reason why Paul uses unmarried and widows is because in the Greek, in fact, he goes so far as to say in the Koine Greek, there was really no word used for a single person, right? That someone was single. That's what they would have been referred to as the Greek word for betrothed, right? Um, and so no one would have said, "Oh, this person's single." And so he suggests that unmarried means widower. So if you read it, verse 8, to the unmarried, so it'd be to the widower and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single. Oh, well, there's the word single, as I am, right? But that's the English translation. That's what the translator did this. Here's the reason why. How were widows considered in Jewish culture, in early Christian culture? How were they considered? Think about it. What does James say? The one true religion is taking care of who? And why is that? Because often they are considered destitute. They have nothing. They have no husband to take care of them, right? They don't have a protector. They're not going to, no one's going to pay for their food, right? No one's going to provide for them. But as a man, right, as a man, a widower, well, I can still work, especially in that culture, right? We remember how I said you got to kind of jump back into first century Christianity there. We got to get into the historical understanding of all this. And as a man, I can go get work. I can take care of myself. It's interesting theory. Yeah, it was kind of fun to read. Who knows? But nevertheless, where Paul's talking about is he continues to say that if you do not currently have a spouse, in verse 8, that it is good. Try to remain single, unmarried, as he is. But if you cannot exercise self-control, they should be married, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. We talked last week that this concept of burning with passion is not any kind of internal judgment, but rather the literal tempting of the flesh. That urging, that sense of desire that wells up within someone. And then he says this. This is kind of where we left off here last week. In verse 10, to the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. What he is going to instruct here over the next, 1.5 verses roughly, is the same teaching that Jesus gave. And let's go back before that. It's the same teaching that God desires way back in the Old Testament with the old law and the various Levitical laws, right? Even though Moses, right, he allows the people to grant a certificate of divorce, this is not God's desire. It's never been God's desire. Okay? But here, Paul is saying, now listen, to the married, those who are married, and he's specifically referring to two Christian people. So both the husband and the wife are Christians, and they are married. Okay? So in Corinth, this could have looked like this. When Paul comes along, right, and the church is established and he works there for a while, you have two Gentile believers, and they're married and they both become Christians. Again, we got to look at this history first, right? Let's look at first reader first. That's what we're going to flesh out here. He gives the same instruction, of course, that Jesus does, and it's this: the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. It's mutual, right? There is no favoritism. Paul is not saying that it's one side or the other. As as Christian, as married Christian couples, right? We should we should do everything we can to reconcile our differences. Which, oh, by the way, even though it would be incredibly painful, and this is one of the reasons that Jesus says you can get remarried, or one reason Jesus says you can get remarried, the concept of adultery, fornication outside the marriage body, the marriage covenant. Even then, God desires reconciliation. How do we know that for sure? You don't have to go very far, but read a handful of chapters, which is the entire book of Hosea. Am I getting that right? Okay, I had to look at the wife real quick. About how God tells Hosea to go back and get her, redeem her. God always desires the reconciliation. Yes. Yeah. Right. 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 Well, here's the deal. And the elders have been discussing these very concepts of these matters. And quite frankly, if you were to have two Christians who are married and have been married for a time, and for whatever reason are having those types of issues, which are serious issues, it's likely because one or both parties is essentially acting as a non-Christian. You're acting as an unbeliever. And guess what? Let me continue, and we're going to see what Paul says about dealing with an unbeliever. Okay? And so he's saying here in verses 10 and 11, he's like, look, nothing's new. And it's not just Jesus, but it's even going back to God's original design in the Old Testament within the law, right? You were married for life, right? You were married for life. Let's see what he says in verse 10, though. Now, this is different. Remember, when Jesus says those things in Matthew, I'm going to go back. It's Matthew 19, Matthew 5, and a couple other passages. I think it's Mark 10 and Luke somewhere as well. But when Jesus is saying this, context is everything, even in that, even when he's giving this instruction about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, right? And what he says there is he's speaking to Pharisees who are what? They're married, okay? And they're both Jewish. They both believe the same thing, okay? They are They are not what's the right term? It's a New Testament term, but it's the concept of not being unequally yoked, right? They did not. Many of them did not marry outside of the tribe in which they were supposed to marry, right? But now we have something different in Corinth. We have something different, and it's this: to the rest, I, not the Lord. Excuse me. To the rest, I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, he should not divorce him. Right? Okay. So remember, in Corinth, by the time Paul writes this letter, the church is still very young. It's roughly 4 years old. Okay? And so the reason why the Corinthians may have wrote a letter to Paul that he's addressing throughout First Corinthians is they had questions about this. Because why? Why? Think about it. They have been taught that their bodies are supposed to be a temple of the Holy Spirit, that they are not to defile their bodies with a prostitute or in the practice of sexual morality, even if it's with some other random person, right? A prostitute or somebody that is participating in this practice are unbelievers. So now they have questions. Well, wait a second. If a married Gentile couple right, are who are together, and one converts and the other doesn't, then we have holiness and we have unbelieving. If we participate in that approved physical intimacy, are we defiling our bodies? Are we defiling ourselves because we're having relations with an unbeliever? This didn't come up when Jesus was talking about marriage, divorce, remarriage, if you will, in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 and Mark 10 and the other passages in Luke. He's talking to Pharisees who were married who had Jewish wives. There was a common belief, right? That covenant was okay. They were, if you will, believers together. But in Corinth, you very likely had someone who was converted and someone who decided not to convert. And so if she consents to live with him or he consents to live with her, they should not divorce each other. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Do you think Paul's actually saying that they're holy and they're saved and they're sanctified by association? No. But let's be real. There's many of us in the congregation right here who um, were brought up or raised as Christians, and for whatever reason they fell in love with somebody. They married this individual who maybe wasn't a Christian at the time, and many of us, okay, in fact, everyone who I know, eventually their spouse converted, right? Their spouse converted. It is believed by most scholars, most theologians here, that what Paul is saying is that it is better to stay, if you can live at peace. In fact, that's going to be the instruction here in a minute. If you can live at peace, a believer with an unbeliever, that the influence of the believer will do wonders for the unbeliever. It would be better for that unbelieving spouse and that believing spouse to remain together than for the unbeliever to depart and go right back out where they may not be impacted or influenced by a believer. Right? Back out with the old friends, right? The old practices, the sinful immorality, right? So so the idea is that they're the believer and their holy influence, their practice, right, will make a deep and great impact on the unbeliever. And oh, by the way, the children, right? They will be okay as well because remember, these children would have likely been raised with an extreme emphasis and focus on the gospel of Christ. Because why? Well, remember, first century Christians, and us today too, I'm not saying us today too, but these first century Christians, they're having their lives completely changed for the better by coming to know Christ. Their faith is growing. Now, their practices are weak. Right? They're weak individuals. The flesh is very weak in Corinth, but the faith is strong, right? And so we know, right? We know that many women, even though it's supposed to be the man's job, by the way, men, which I'm convicting myself a little bit, but many women do the spiritual upbringing of the children. Many women do it. This was common in the Old Testament, and it really continued throughout the New Testament times as well. But the emphasis will be placed on those kids to teach them the gospel of Jesus because it is so much more important to that believing spouse. In short, Paul is not saying that simply because an unbeliever is married to a believer that they will be sanctified or made holy or saved by association, but that they have a better chance of having a positive godly influence on the unbeliever, hopefully to the point that they convert. Um, any questions about that? Yeah. Right. Mhm. No, and you're right. It, I had to do some more looking up because when we get into verse 24, I was really hoping to get a little further tonight. Maybe I did a little bit too much review, but um, Paul's going to use a term later on about the present distress. It's in 1 Corinthians 7, 26, and I'm like, ooh, what's this about, right? And later on in the same chapter, he talks about that the appointed time has grown very short. That's in verse 29. So he continues the thought about why he suggests that it may be wise to stay unmarried. But he never condemns, he never says it's a sin to get married, right? It's the choice of the individual, right? And so let me just get a little bit further. And I'll get back. You can have the closing comments. But in verse 15, it says, "But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved." Okay, God has called you to peace. So this needs to be fleshed out and it needs to be prayed upon and it needs to be studied out, right? But here's the deal: if the unbelieving partner separates, they desire to go, or there is a separation because someone acts unbelieving, and there is no peace in that marriage. Okay, um, then what it really says is you're not enslaved. So I looked up the Greek word for not enslaved, and it was bound. You're no longer bound to the person who goes away. Okay, and so if potentially if there is extreme um, unrest, no peace in the marriage, even violent, right? What it sounds like is that individual is not acting like a believer. And if they have tried to practice church discipline, right? That's part of this process, right? The unbelieving one, the one who's acting not like a Christian, they will be disciplined in hopes that they will change. But if it continues this way, according to Paul, and there's a separation, especially if the unbeliever wants to separate, he says you are no longer enslaved. God has called you to peace. How good can we worship God? How good can we follow God if we're constantly at ends with our spouse? It's far more important that we ourselves live godly, devoted, intimate lives with Christ. I'm still going to get to you. I'm going to push it a couple more minutes. And then, verse 16, "For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?" This goes back to the idea of we don't really know. If we marry a non-Christian, we really don't know if they will one day accept Christ as their Savior. We don't know that, right? And so Paul's saying, don't feel like you are bound. Don't feel like you are under some legal obligation, spiritually speaking, to go after that unbeliever because you think that maybe you can still save them, right? Um, that there's a difference between one who wants to be there, an unbeliever who decides to consent and to live in peace, versus someone who doesn't. Okay, versus someone who doesn't. Yes. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Right. 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 And well, and of course, like one of the signs, or the decay, I guess, of humanity, and one of the signs of the end times, which by the way, Paul writes, Paul's going to start using language here that suggests that maybe made the Corinthians think, or even other people who read this, that Paul had in mind that Jesus could come back during the life of the Corinthians that he's writing to. But Paul continually writes in a manner which um, suggests that he understands that when Christ ascended, that we are living in the end times. And these concepts about millennialism and premillennialism and postmillennialism, you actually don't find that type of language, that type of theology in any of Paul's writing, which is rather interesting as well, just so we know. Um, I'm going to keep going until Ben comes in because I didn't cover as much as I wanted to. Let's get into 17 real quick. This is the thing. Look, if you've been reading every word in preparation for Wednesdays, you've seen Paul say, give this command and this command, and then something here that you're like, wait a second, and how does that relate to this? And I thought he said this over here. But he has constantly been teaching laws about the way we should, what's the right term? Should practice holiness with our bodies. He's given instructions about marriage now, and these kinds of things. But ultimately, he's going to say, look, each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him in which God has called them. Right? So if you came to Christ single and you can remain single, don't think that you have to marry. Another thing that I probably should have discussed, but I would have taken up even more time, but Ben's giving me a couple extra minutes, which I appreciate, is there was a theory, because they had this belief system in a Gentile pagan belief, that these concepts about these women who remained unchasted, um, that somehow they were far superior, far greater um, to their pagan gods than someone who was married. Okay, um, and so perhaps that worked its way into some of this, where some of these women were like, well, should I leave my husband for this reason, who's an unbeliever, or should I remain single so that I can be more with Christ? Paul's giving very practical reasons to get married here, okay? Which is honestly probably what many of us, not the only reason why many of us get married, but one of the reasons we get married, okay? But he's saying, look, lead the life that God has assigned to you. So the words for assigned and to call are very unique words, right? God has given us some of these desires, right? God has placed in our hearts certain things that we can live with and live without. He has given some of us the ability to live more of a quiet, maybe a solemn life, okay, versus people who need to be around a lot of other people, okay? This is my rule in all the churches. Okay, if you're single, try to remain single. If you're married, great. And if you're married to an unbeliever and they're willing to stay, stay. Right? This is my rule in all the churches. We're going to stop there and we're going to start in verse 18 with a little bit of review next Wednesday.
voice has been going in and out, so hopefully it holds up here. The invitation is going to be 7:14. The invitation song 7:14. I think everybody's in. Good evening. Um, so I enjoy watching sports on my free time, and pretty much when we're home and the TV's on, we're probably watching a game or some kind of some kind of sport. Over the years, when I've watched professional sports games, you hear coaches and players. They get interviewed before or after a game, and they're all trained to say pretty much the same things. They answer every question with these sayings or phrases that they've been drilled into them, like take it one play at a time, or you play to win the game. Um, One that Nick Saban, who he was the coach of the University of Alabama, um, Hall of Fame coach. He's credited for saying you have to control the controllables. It sounds a little redundant, but when you think about it, this expression is really valuable. To It's a very valuable way to think about things. In sports, there's so many variables that go into winning a game or a match. There's the quality of your opponent, the factors of the venue and in which in where the game is being played, like bad weather, good weather, whether you have a good field you're playing on, and how good your team is, how good your coaches are. At the end of the day, there's a lot of things that are out of your control. There's a lot of variables that can affect a game in a good or a bad way that you can't control. The point of the saying controlling the controllables in the context of sports is to focus on yourself and what you can control. Some examples of that are your effort, how you prepare, your mindset, your reaction to when you have adversity, and how you communicate. In sports, if everybody focuses on controlling what they can control instead of worrying about the things they can't control, you have a better chance of being successful. In my daily walk as a Christian, sometimes I get so worked up about things in my life and things that are happening in the world. I find myself worrying about things that I have no control of whatsoever. Uh, I get frustrated with people that I deal with in the public, my coworkers. I get frustrated with certain family members, nobody that's here. Uh, I get frustrated that it's 90 degrees in March. Um, I get frustrated when I turn the news on. But I need to remind myself that God in His Word tells us to control what we can control and to trust in Him. Um, Jesus in Matthew 6, he talks about how we should not worry. And in verse 34, he says, "Be not therefore anxious for the morrow, for the morrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." James 1:19 talks about how we need to control how we communicate. When he says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger." Um, 1 Timothy 6:11, "Be you man of God, flee from all this and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness." There's so many more verses that illustrate this, but one of my favorite ones that I always try to remember is Proverbs 16:9, which says, "In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps." At the end of the day, all we can do is control what we can control. If we strive to make sure our effort, preparation, our mindset, how we react to adversity, and how we communicate to others line up with what God wants us to do and what God's word says we need to, we have comfort in knowing that God is going to take care of the rest one way or another. If you've been struggling and need prayers of the congregation, or if you're ready to put on Christ in baptism tonight, come forward as we stand and sing.